had this guy who was like a hi-fi guy, and he didn't really have any subs. He didn't believe in any DSP stuff. But I brought my U mic, and he had all this expensive gear, and all this like bass traps and all this stuff, all kinds of stuff. And I did some measurements, and I realized that he was sitting in a null, and just moving the chair a foot and a half forward would bring him out of that null.
Yeah.
And so it was just funny. $100 mic is all we needed to improve his sound. You probably didn't have to spend thousands of dollars on this one cable.
Right. There's sort of a hierarchy of the way you approach this, and mine is you better check all the spots in the room first before you settle on a location. A lot of times, someone will come to us with this predetermined setup and say everything has to go here. And I have to sit there. Okay, then your hands are sort of tied, because if it doesn't measure well with that setup, then you're kind of stuck with it, because you can't change the room dimensions, and generally you can't change the speaker locations because they're sort of defined by the video display and the surround back, overhead, high channels, whatever. But oftentimes you can move the subwoofer if you have some flexibility. And boy, that spot's terrible. Let's try that one over there, or this one here, or one maybe in the back corner. And bam, you find a spot that measures pretty darn well without a really big null. Nulls are the worst, as you know. We can deal with peaks a little bit easier than nulls, but if there's a big null there, I just line through that location. Hey, that's just a bad spot, dude. You don't want to put your subwoofer there.
Nick can just sell.
That's it.
Nick can just sell them more subs then. In that case, in that one spot, then let's just more subs. Then we'll fix it right up.
Think about this, Joe. If you got a spot with a null, and you put a subwoofer in another part of the room, and you can fill in that null, so to speak, right? Because that other sub doesn't have a null at that frequency. Well, it looks good on the frequency response chart, doesn't it? But what are you still missing? You're missing the dynamic output of the first subwoofer, which has a massive null at that frequency that never changes. So you say, look at the combined dynamic output of the system. It's going to be lower over that bandwidth where the null exists than it would be everywhere else where both subs are contributing max. So when you really start pushing the system hard and you're like, oh, it's not hitting in the mid bass like I expected it would, that's because one of them has a null and it's not contributing. And that's never going to go away.
That's why I use MSO though. You could have like, all right, that one, you do what you do. This guy, you take over in this null, and then what I'm saying?
That's again though, if there's a null, there's a null, and you're going to get lower output there, and that's never going to change. It's just the acoustics of the room. So I always try and not put the sub in a null to start, and then we deal with peaks more easily.
I think what you said is also, it seems like make sure that your seat is not in a null.
Yeah.
Your actual.
Well, that's what I meant. Yeah, sure.
What can you do? You just gave me an idea. Maybe those unused seats, I should just put subs on both sides, huh?
There it is.
You can move the listening position sometimes, but oftentimes, again, you want to sit where the speakers and the video display are optimal, but you can move the sub a lot more easily. So that's usually what we end up doing.
So, well, right here it says subwoofer placement, best place to start, and the methodology. What are some good places? If you had to guess, here's a room. I don't know everything about it, but
I'm a little bit older than you guys, so I'm going to date myself. But back in the day, everybody said, don't stick the sub in a corner because it's going to sound boomy. Is there some validity to that? Maybe. If you put the sub in a corner, you might get a standing wave peak where it doesn't exist somewhere else. But again, we can deal with peaks now a lot more easily than we could 30 years ago when EQ was a little bit more difficult to implement. But I always say start in a corner, because a corner placement will excite every standing wave pattern in the room. There's 5 different types of standing wave patterns in the room. Corner placement excites all of them. That gives you the densest standing wave pattern. Now, is it possible placing the sub in a corner ends up where you're sitting? Is there a null? Maybe. But again, you're going to have a denser standing wave pattern and a higher chance of not encountering a null when you start with a corner. If you have EQ, great, because if there's a peak in the response, we can knock it out. But if you place the sub, say, for example, in the middle of a wall, middle of the front wall, middle of the side wall, you're creating a standing wave pattern between that sub and the side walls where it wouldn't otherwise exist if it was actually in the corner. So then there's the potential starts to increase for seeing mid and upper base nulls that are created between the sub and the side walls, or the sub and the opposite wall where it wouldn't exist if it was corner loaded. So I always say start in a corner, see how it looks, see how it measures, see how it sounds. If we need to move it, fine. But that's where I start.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that. I like to recommend just throw it in the corner. It's going to give you extra bass. Like that's just extra, you know. You can tame it afterwards, like you said. But I think it's a great place to start. And how about in addition to that? Let's say, all right, for some reason they're not going to put in the corners. Maybe it's maybe the space doesn't allow for it. What's maybe another good option? And
if we talking one sub or two,
let's just say two subs, like because I see some people putting it about like a quarter of the way or 2/3 of the way, just because it looks nice. You know, they have their floor standing speakers, then they have their TV, and then they put it right in between. Is that a good spot?
Well, you know, there's something to be said for visual symmetry on the front stage, right? Everybody likes, oh yeah, I got my mains, I got my center, I got my two subs up here. If they're corner loaded, I think that's optimal. We've seen all seen the Harman International, you know, Todd Welty measurements. 1/4 in or 1/3 in tends to measure pretty well. But again, the farther you get away from the sidewall, let's say they're in the corners, and then you start marching them in, and you're at 1/4 or even the 1/3, 2/3 points. Do you have the potential to create a standing wave between the subwoofer and the sidewall, depending on the room size? Yes, you do. So as you start marching them away from the corners, and if you do have a microphone and Room EQ Wizard, you start to see ripples in the upper bass response that weren't there before, and that's because there's a new standing wave pattern that you've created because you're moving it away from the corner. Aside from visual symmetry, both subs on the front stage, you're never going to get rid of the front to rear standing wave null, and that is probably the most problematic that we encounter in the room. It's the most persistent, and it tends to be in the mid bass region where you're sitting. And I've seen sweeps. Hey, I got both subs on the front. Here's my Room EQ Wizard sweep. Wham! There's a 15 or 20 dB null at 45 hertz or 40 hertz or something like that, and we're like, wow, that's bad. Can you move this listening position forward or rearward? Not really. Well, okay, let's try opposite diagonal corners. That's my favorite setup for dual subs.
Okay.
You know, say front left, right rear, or front right left rear. And the reason why is that addresses all 5 of the standing wave patterns in the room and gives you a higher chance of having a flatter frequency response at the listening position.
All right, if you would like to join us every week on Mondays at, what time is it? About 6 p.m. Central, which is the best time. That's where I am. Make sure you join us at youtube.com/Daily HiFi. We out.